Afternoon. Hello, everyone. Enjoy the insight this afternoon. Are you? I think Renette is. I don't know if she's in the meeting, but I know she. There's another also concurrent meeting in the Western Cape, and that's why basically I was requested to chair this meeting. Okay, I think maybe with that, let us start this. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Friday webinar. This is time we set aside every week to engage around our key findings, to note the work that is done in other units, and to find connections and synergy to what we are doing, even if we're not in that specific area of work, even if we perform quite a different function, we can always learn by the lessons and by connecting it to our day work every day. My name is Hermie Borain. I am a Chief Director for Data Analytics in the Public Expenditure and Policy Analysis Unit, also called PEPA in GTAC. So it is my privilege today to introduce to you our speaker, Velisubuhle Buti. He's a Senior Budget Analyst in the Justice and Protection Services Chief Directorate under Public Finance. He provides budget and policy support to the police services departments. He joined Treasury in 2011 as an intern in the Health and Social Development Chief Directorate, but also worked in the Labour, they also did the budget and analysis for Labour in another Chief Directorate. Veli is very well grounded academically, and I think in this he is quite an example to our career entrance. So in this 10 years since he's joined Treasury, he also managed to build his qualifications. He's got a master's in public policy from the Australian National University and an honours in industrial sociology and labour studies from the University of Pretoria. His research interests also include evidence-based policy making, leadership, national security policy, public engagement and civic talk, policy analysis, storytelling through data. He's also conducted a few spending reviews on various topics. And today he will share his findings on a recent spending review on the costing of ICT services in the police services group. So a very hearty word of welcome to you, Veli. It's my pleasure to facilitate the session. I know Veli from some engagements we had on data, and so I want you to please go ahead and enlighten us on this interesting topic.
Thank you so much, Hemi, and good afternoon, everyone. May I just please check if I'm audible?
I can hear you. I can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you. Let me then just share my presentation. Okay, so can you just confirm, Hemi, you can, is it the presentation visible?
Yes, we can see you. We can see it properly. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Hemi. So as you have indicated, the spending review that we conducted was within ICT services in the police services family. And this includes departments such as police, the civilian secretariat for the police service, and the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, together with the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority. So it was sort of within the broad umbrella of ICT, but however, we also benchmarked with other departments at national level. We had about 10 departments, which included Stats SA, Transport, Public Enterprises, Employment and Labor, to mention just a few, because we wanted to get a comprehensive amount of data that is going to show us what are the spending trends on ICT in government, and also given the fact that we are looking at a relatively smaller sample of departments within the police service, are we not going to really run the risk of having attribution errors if we do not compare with other departments? So it was very useful to collaborate with colleagues from urban development, from admin services, who are responsible for the different departments, and they also assisted in providing the data during that analysis. In terms of topic 2, SAPS, it was actually a follow-up, because you would recall, Hemi, in the 2020 round, we also did a spending review in the SAPS, and we found a lot of findings there, such as heavy reliance on Cita, and the fact that the spending by SAPS is actually quite one of the highest in government, and together with departments such as defense. In fact, from the whole cluster, you'll find that the biggest clients of Cita are from within the Justice and Protection Services. And then as part of last year, we even did a site visit to SAPS to try to say, show us some of the systems that you have, how do they work, and how do they actually help you as a department to improve operationally. So the second leg of the presentation will then delve into the reflections that we picked up during those site visits. I think to start off, the spending reviews, actually, they really play a very important role, both in the work that we do in public finance, but also the work that the National Treasury does in terms of providing budget and technical support to departments. Essentially, these reviews, they support strategic cost management in departments. They also improve program performance and spending efficiency. So they're a really good lightning rod exercise that we use to actually get some insight and understand what is actually happening. And also what we did last year is to invite departments to be part of the process and not just collect the data and try to write reports, but they were part of our bi-monthly review meetings. We would receive the data from the departments, and then we analyze it, and then we ask questions. And those sessions were really useful because we were able to validate the data. We also were able to get inputs to understand what is happening. It was really helpful in that regard. The methodology we used is the standard GTAC review methodology, which has about 6 steps. We also linked the methodology with the zero-based budgeting framework, which actually has got some really important steps and also key activity costing guides. And the fact that ICT is very granular in nature, you're actually looking at SLA information, you're looking at number of meetings that are held in relation to ICT, but you also analyze ICT governance framework policies. So this methodology, together with the zero-based budgeting framework, they really were useful in helping us to unpack some of the ICT related issues. There were few limitations, as any study would tell. There will always be those limitations that you are unable to do. The first one would be inconsistent attendance in the bi-monthly sessions. I think we still need to do a lot of work to try to appetize departments about these spending reviews and to try to get a good buy-in from them. And how we also do that is to demonstrate the findings and also show the value in them. For example, if there are savings that they're able to realize, they can reprioritize those savings within their baselines. But most importantly, the fact that the spending review process also has got best practices and benchmarking approaches. It helps to see why are other departments better managing their ICT arrangements than others. There were few data gaps, especially in the space of the police. It's not within BES and it's using its own Polfin system and getting some of this data. Sometimes it takes time, and also the classifications that are used in relation to personnel are not the same. So we had to map everything and try to understand it better. Most importantly, the dependencies on Cita. I think this is one of the biggest limitations that is facing the entire review, or the number of projects that are being done for spending reviews. We've got huge dependencies on Cita. We've got huge dependencies on departments of public works and infrastructure, and therefore the extent in which you implement these recommendations or these findings will then have to take into account, because there is legislation that is in place that actually mandates Cita to provide ICT services in government. So that's a huge dependency that we have flagged. But the reviews also have showed that there is poor knowledge management and record keeping in departments where they have ICT systems, they've got registers in place, but come audit time, there are a lot of IT, or there are a lot of internal control findings that are mapped out. And that's one of the limitations that we picked up. So some of the assumptions that we then looked into when we did the analysis is to try to ask big questions about, given the fact that data is available so much today, and given the fact that the departments in one way or another, they are collecting data, how are they using this data to make decisions, number one? And number two, is ICT still relevant in terms of their operations? And if it is relevant, who should then provide this service? Should it be provided through Cita? Should it be provided through external service providers like your Vodacom? Or should departments in one way or the other in-source or have their own internal capacity? And what we saw here is that because the Cita Amendment Act in Section 7 is quite very specific about those musts that must be done, there is legal room for departments to maneuver, because even in terms of network upgrades, Cita still has to do the maintenance, even if Telkom can do the installation, but the maintenance must be done by Cita because that is part of the act. Even bulk procurement of ICT equipment and even servers, it's done through Cita. So then departments end up remaining with legal budget in terms of personnel and even trying to procure some of the equipment externally. But then within this arrangement, then there's an important question of how do we better engage Cita to better deliver these services? The SLA meetings, we found that they are not consistently happening between departments. They are scheduled to be done on a quarterly basis, and this is also in their operational plans, but these meetings are not happening. And this has got an impact in terms of the timely procurement of ICT equipment. It even has got an impact in terms of spending, because we see much spikes at the end of the financial year because there was poor engagement with Cita right throughout the process. We also looked at issues of effectiveness and efficiency. And here we found issues such as duplication of services. We found that the value for money in terms of the acquisition of ICT and even being part of some of the transversal contracts that could help departments to save on cost, that is not being done in some of the departments. We found that also internal ICT capacity is a big problem in our department, and it's even more concerning in departments like police that have got a huge staff complement, not just in terms of police officers, but even ICT, because they have a whole division that is responsible for technology management services. But the staff that is there does not have maybe your network programmers, enough network programmers, enough software developers, actual specialists of ICT that could help the department to improve. And then it then makes you to see that part of the reason why we have these inefficiencies is because of those limitations. We also, the review helped us to unpack and see, is ICT well utilized within departments? Yes, you have applications that you are utilizing. We have My SAPS app that even a person in their homes, they can be able to submit tip-offs to the police and even see their nearest police station. But the assessment of the data collection is not effectively done. And I will also elaborate this later on when I talk about the site visits that we did in police. And just to then jump straight to the crux of the matter, which I think is what everybody is interested to find out, is some of the key findings or the broad themes that this review actually came about was to say ICT transversal contracts are very useful entry points for cost management. So the key finding here is that for departments to effectively assess whether they are going to generate savings or not, they have to ask themselves, how many systems do we have? How many systems do we use? How much money are we spending on these systems? And most importantly, are these systems relevant in line with our mandate and also our operations? And therefore, when we then also want to go further down the zero-based budgeting framework, is to say what activities are being performed under each component of the ICT. Mobile communication, for example, there's an RT15 contract for that, and it has shown that it's a cost-effective method of managing data management in departments. Stats SA has an RT15 contract for its APN services. IPID also, when it took part in the RT15, it started to realize savings. And therefore, this does point that these transversal contracts, they really are quite useful. And some of the departments are not even part, especially the small departments, are not part of these contracts. And their spending on even airtime and data is quite high. And it can therefore be better managed by implementing zero-based budgeting principles and also using these transversal contracts to manage the cost. The second big finding is the issue of the tariffs that Cita charges for certain services. They are quite high for small departments. And here, by small departments, we are talking about the Civilian Secretariat for the Police Service. We are talking about an IPID. We are talking about the GCIS. We are talking about all these small departments, because when we unpack the items underneath there, we find that a civilian would be paying 4.5 million for learner and desktop support services. And this is quite high, even when you compare it with bigger departments like transport that pay relatively less for that very same service. And the reason for that is because of internal capacity gaps in these departments. For as long as they are not capacitating themselves to have the right IT technicians and even right IT programmers, is actually going to continue to remain the same. And in talking about the learner and network technicians as well, the Stats has got its own network programmers, and it's not necessarily incurring cost for that learner and desktop support service. And they pay about 2.1 million for those deputy directors who are employed in that component. Now you compare it with a small department that pays about 4.5 million for 1 or 2 people that are being sent by Cita. Then it shows you that there is scope to capacitate internally, especially for those services that department do not really have to procure through Cita. There's also a need for cost sharing arrangements, especially at cluster level. The review also showed that there needs to be better contract negotiation and effective activity costing, especially on standard software licenses in departments. So here, the issue was mainly around Microsoft, that some departments are able to procure Microsoft software on multi-year arrangements for 3 years, for 5 years. Transport is able to do it for 3 years. Stats is able to do it at 20 million for 5 years. But you look at smaller departments, you look at entities like CIRA, they don't really have these multi-year agreements in place. And that actually poses a risk in terms of the budget, because there are issues of exchange rate fluctuations. There's also poor assessment of how do we even procure the procurement, procure the software, not procure the procurement, procure the software. How many people are using Microsoft Office? Should we buy it for everyone? And what cost implication does that have for us? And we also found that there is value in capacitating internally, especially for those less critical or critical positions that departments can be able to fill themselves and therefore save on SLA costs. They can even develop their own case management systems internally. And lastly, there is scope to use open source or on-demand services. And this is what even private companies are doing now. Instead of buying these new systems, maybe have an application that is on demand and that is actually quite secure. And an example that our study picked up was from Cira. Cira actually has a mobile application that security officers and even security service providers utilize when they need to do online bookings, when they need to track the status of their applications. They can use that. They can use the app, and they only spend about 15,000. We had to really interrogate that and ask a lot of questions, and they confirmed they pay about 15,000 per year for that mobile applications. But other departments in the cluster, they also are busy developing mobile applications, and they are paying way more than that. They are paying about 7 million. And then we were asking the questions, why not consider these on-demand services so that you are able to save on cost? And this slide basically shows the ICT KPIs within the police services departments. And the main issue that I would like to highlight here is that we found very striking similarities between the IPID and the private security industry regulatory authority, both in terms of the size of the budget on ICT. It's almost similar, and even the cost per head, or the ICT cost per FTE in both institutions is actually more or less the same, but the quality of the ICT staff, although the budget is the same, but it's not, it's worlds apart, right? Cira is able, it has got its own software programmers, it has got its own few network managers, but the IPID does not. And one of the recommendations that the study proposes for the IPID to actually engage with Cira to find some of the best practices, and also the fact that Cira has implemented a digital transformation strategy that has actually helped it to improve its operations, and it's also helping it to automate some of its services. There is therefore scope to compare. So this review really helps us when we unpack all the items and try to see who is spending how much and who is spending more on which item. And this item shows, or this slide shows, the Cita cost between the Civilian Secretariat and the IPID. And what we found here is that because of the internal capacity problems I spoke about earlier on, the civilian was paying more. And the value of the review, actually, the Civilian Secretariat has reprioritized this money over the 2022 MTF because of the review, and they're going to appoint their own learner and desktop management staff internally, because what the departments also indicated is that what these guys do from Cita, they can be able to do it themselves. And you see it by the fact that other departments do not have that service, as I said earlier on. So we also found that. Mobile communication, we found that departments that participate in the transversal contracts, they're able to lower their cost on mobile communication and data. The IPID, for example, over the past between 2016, 17 and 2020, spending on its mobile communications, it actually declined by an average annual growth rate of 21%. Now you compare it with other departments that are not part of that transversal contracts, like your Civilian Secretariat, your States SA, your Cira, you see spending fluctuations. For example, in Cira, 15% average escalation rate, and you also see the Civilian Secretariat over 10%. And both Cira and Civilian have actually committed and are in the process of even consulting the OCPO to be part of these transversal contracts. This slide also shares a similar message with the previous one, but it looks at Microsoft license fees. The main point we had here, and also our discussions with the colleagues from Cira, is that why is it that if government has got these enterprise agreements with Microsoft, with Huawei, and all these big ICT companies, why do we see massive fluctuations in terms of Microsoft license fees? Why not have standard contracts in place? Why do we see other departments able to fix their license fees, whereas others are not. And the response that we actually got from Cita is that they've got initiatives in place of building a single public service view. They are also exploring the notion of having cluster-based software arrangements. In other words, in terms of the Justice and Protection Services departments that are more or less within that cluster, then they can procure software for them collectively, and that could save cost going forward. And this slide, it basically shows data from the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. And what we did here, we asked the department, how much do you spend on Microsoft licenses per year? And how many users do you buy the software for? And the department was able to give us that data. And what it then shows is that there is a risk when in terms of buying software, not just Microsoft. It should be bought for the actual number of users that are going to use the software, because the risk here is fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Because if we are buying software for about 20,000 employees in the department, and you find that 5,000 of those employees are actually cleaners, they're actually maybe security officers or even garden services people who do not use this software. So it's a big risk, and it presents some audit risk with for departments, and we have shared those findings as well. This slide also shows the cost per user on Microsoft. Again, here the main issue that we were also asking is that the absence of not one government contract for Microsoft licenses, or even a cluster-based one, it gives us these very uneven figures. You have a small department, a civilian secretariat, where the cost per user for the software is actually almost the same with a much bigger department like Justice. You also have an IPID that is actually quite smaller compared to Status A, but yet the cost per user on these licenses is actually almost the same. So there is really a scope to consolidate things together. We then summarize and package the recommendations, which also present the savings roughly for the police services departments, and the findings or the recommendations, we tried to nail it to them because we are responsible for those departments. But in the actual report, we also included the other departments, and we have shared the report as well. It's about 19.1 million. Some of these are real savings. Some of them will result in reprioritization of the budget internally. For example, the Civilian Secretariat, by reducing the learner and desktop service, it's reprioritizing that budget internally, basically from goods and services to compensation of employees, to appoint its own internal staff. And these recommendations as well, we will track them or trace them during the MTF discussions to try to assess what is the progress, what are some of the challenges that our departments facing in terms of implementing these findings, because as much as we share it with them, they also have to take time to study. They also have to assess what is implementable and what is doable within what period. Most of them, in our perspective, can be done within the current financial year, because it's really about consulting Cita. It's really about learning best practices from other departments that have been included in the study. And also some of them may take longer, especially the one where they have to review the utilization of contracts, where they have to maybe not renew certain contracts. That may take some time because there are contractual obligations that are tying departments in that respect. And then the last part is going to provide the reflections from the SAPS. And as I've said before, we did the review before on SAPS, and now we also wanted to use a different approach and also do site visit to see the systems that the department has. And what we found is that out of the 879 ICT employees that the department has, almost half were in admin positions. This includes security personnel, food services aid, cleaners and general workers, and admin personnel and clerks. And part of the reason is because the nature of the South African police, how it is actually structured, and the nature of its operations is quite a very large department. But what the department also confirmed is that they are busy doing their own HR review to try to streamline the entire TMS division and also try to capacitate and employ more ICT technicians. So they are busy refining that exercise. We found that some of the systems that the department has, they do have limitations and gaps, such as the enhanced firearms register systems. Applicants are unable to upload documents, they are unable to upload photos and signatures. And this also has an impact because it's a core system that the department also uses to deliver on its mandate. And then in terms of the quantitative or the quantity of the savings, we found about 30 million in this round on SAPS. So this is in addition to what we had found last year. And it's mainly around the systems that the department has, because the key question we asked is that you've got so many systems. Why don't you abolish or also in sources systems? You have got more than 800 ICT staff. Why not develop the systems internally? Why not learn from departments like Stats SA that also develop some of the systems internally for spatial planning, for collecting data, and for doing research, and they don't have SLA cost for those systems. And most of the systems, as you can see here, they're admin related, such as the one where there is circulation, there's also a registration system, e-tail system, second-hand goods control. So these are not your core detective services, crime intelligence, or very specialized systems, but it's systems that even an intern that just finished IT can develop it for the department. And we feel like if they can do that, they will save almost 30 million per year. We also found that the division is quite large, and part of the jump here was the reclassification of radio technical services staff. So in SAPS, they've got many divisions, and one of them is visible policing. So the officers that actually were responsible for radio technical services in provinces actually were classified to be part of the TMS division. And that has resulted in the significant jump on personnel and also has resulted in spending increase over the 5-year period. But as I've said, the department is actually reviewing the entire division to try to look at the job descriptions and also to try to assess how do they capacitate themselves and modernize their systems much better. And then we delved into the actual systems now. And one of the key issues we asked is that how does the department monitor data and system utilization by its division? And we found that there are limitations here, and it's quite not so clear. The TMS does the procurement of the systems and applications on behalf of the SAPS, but it does not have the actual data that shows that which divisions are using these systems more, or which divisions are actually utilizing this system more. My SAPS is an example. That is, it's used mainly by the detective services environment, but the TMS is unable to see that the data that is reported through my SAPS, how does it lead to leads being generated? How does it lead to the number of crimes that are reported being investigated? And the data or the information that is reported through my SAPS, how different is it than the one that is reported in other platforms? And where is the volume and where is the value for money in that respect? So the fact that there are these limitations of being unable to see actual data utilization, it makes it difficult, because what we expected, I think we probably had an FBI mentality. We thought we're going to get into this huge room that has all this system that shows the graphs, that shows all the elements. And part of the reason we don't have that is because these systems are also old, and it's a very, the network infrastructure in the police actually needs to be upgraded, and the department is in the process or has been in the process of upgrading it. So some systems are very old. There were also SCM-related issues that we have noted as part of our site visit. For example, the automatic vehicle location system, a very important system, again, that registers the number of vehicles that the department has. The tender processes for these systems as well were not finalized. And one of the other challenges within the SAPS space is disputes between the department and previous service providers. And we recommended that why does not the department maybe even explore transversal contracts like RT46 on fleet management. So if there are huge issues with previous service providers, when those are resolved as a way of trying to contain the cost, maybe use a transversal contract. And then the department also has got very useful systems like operational management systems. It has MySAPS. It has all these systems that collect information. But the central question that we battled to get a response on is how do these systems help the department to better perform? How does these systems even help it to reprioritize its budget and make its strategic choices? The OPM system, for example, has very interesting functionalities. It captures police force levels. It captures actions executed. You can actually see which constable performs best in the country. You can see which detective is the best in the country from that very system. But it's not clear whether the system is effectively used at police station level. The verification of the data captured on the system is also not clearly specified. So after we capture the data, how do you do the verification? How do you limit manipulation of the data that has been captured? And this is one of the systems that actually has got a great potential that it can be used for performance management in the department, which in turn may improve operational efficiencies. So these are some of the issues that we had picked up, and we're going to have a follow-up session with the department because we have shared the report and we have shared the presentation, and the report is being reviewed, and it's also going to be combined with their own internal review. The department also has other systems like efficiency index system, another very good system that even when they compile the annual report, they use that system because they're able to also see performance targets that have been achieved. They are also, from a resource allocation point of view, able to see which stations are performing better than the others, and therefore how do we reallocate the resources. But the systems, again, they're old and their SLA costs are actually going up every year. So we're asking questions of how do you upgrade them or maybe get better systems that are actually performing much better, and they can help you to make informed decisions in a timely manner. So these are some of the reflections that we have found, that indeed there are many systems on the ground, but it's not clear if we were to really do zero-based budgeting, or if we try to prioritize which systems would we let go, which systems would we integrate as the SAPS. And given the advancement of technology, Uber, for example, has got multiple channels. There's still one app. It has got a channel for a driver, a channel for a client, and even has a channel for Uber Eats. So technology has advanced so much. Why don't we explore those options? And I think there is then a big need to have that conversation even with Cita, given the fact that it procures and develops some of these systems on behalf of departments. That was actually my last slide, Hemi. Thank you so much.
Yo, thank you, Veli. I'm sure you need a sip of water now. Yeah, that was very interesting. I want to open the floor now for any comments. Do we have people from Cita in the room? Do we have people from the police departments? I'm not sure. I see some names that may be from those departments. So you're all invited to make a comment. We recently, we actually in the field, I see Daniel's name here, looking at ICT a few weeks ago. Daniel also did a presentation here about the Cita costing. So that was also quite interesting. Yeah, so maybe what I can do is I think you raised so many things. It looks like one issue that we see is that data is collected, but it's not always analyzed. Is that something you saw? So there's maybe even apart from just the development on the analysis side later in the value chain, also gaps in departments. But I see we have a question from Pale.
Thank you very much, Hemi, and thank you very much, Veli. Very insightful presentation. I'm Palenake from OCPO, Chief Directorate Strategic Procurement. Your study, it's actually very insightful to the project that we are currently doing. As colleagues may know that our Chief Directorate responsibility is to look at the development of strategic procurement, development of procurement strategies for high cost and high value commodities in government. And this financial year, we have actually identified ICT software as one of high spending, high value commodity that we need to look at. And on the basis of that, I'm really appreciating your study, and I'm actually requesting you to open your door for us to come and have a seat, especially your report on topic 1, because it's the one that is mostly relevant to us. And the report and the presentation will actually add value to our research, because we have already started with the research in terms of ICT software procurement in government, and that insightful presentation and report will then add value. So I'm actually humbly requesting that you open your door so that we can have a seat, have access to your report, so as we can be able to collaborate on the project that we are doing in the interest of developing a very good, informative sourcing strategy for ICT software in government. I'll pause here for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that comment, Pale. It also just underlines the need for discussion forums like this one, where work can be shared, and that we know that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. Okay. Any other comment before we give Veli maybe what I can ask Veli, in the spending review, did you go, I'm thinking of the crime statistics, where it's basically where you have a system connecting the whole justice system. Did your research also include that? Because there's also always a lot of criticism about the quality of the data coming from that connected system. I know a few years ago they were busy developing such, and I don't know if there's been some progress on that. But then, I mean, we have 3 more people. Michael, please introduce yourself before you comment. Michael, you can unmute and come on the floor.
Thanks, Michael Akers. I'm part of the GTAC team as well. One of the long-term advisors. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thanks for the presentation. The question I have is whether you've got some thoughts after doing this assessment on what's great is that you've looked at SAPS, which is large, and the Secretariat, which is small. So you've seen that spectrum. But the issue around modernization, where many of the smaller departments are battling to modernize and put into place systems that can help them do their service delivery. Stats SA, you've indicated, has got some successes in this regard. But what's the dynamic there? Do you have a clear plan of how government could try and address strengthening Cita on the one hand? We're doing some work with military veterans at the moment, and they've been on a long trajectory, and their modernization is going particularly poorly. They're small and they don't have material internal capacity, and they can't afford to put it into place, and they've got external reliance. But Cita doesn't understand their business necessarily. This is not a criticism. I think it's the reality. So just some thoughts on how do we speed up modernization? Because in a sense, that's also cost saving. If you can get the modernization to work, you can deliver services at a much lower overall cost. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Daniel?
Thanks, Hemi. Thanks, Philly. I think the study is really quite a robust piece of work, and I think the view or the lens to go into the detail and getting the peculiar issues around some of the procurement and deployment of technologies within the department is really something that we don't spend enough time doing. So I wanted to comment on two things. One was kind of, when I heard Michael's question, I thought to myself, that's kind of exactly where we need to be going. And then the second part is just to speak around the sourcing of ICT software and the role of Cita and departments. So I think one of the things that I would like to put to Veli is how did he find, or how do the departments find the, and speaking back to Pale's issue and where he's coming from, the frameworks around procurement and the strategy and when to go to Cita, when to procure themselves, what was SAPS saying, and what was military veterans saying, when did they choose what or why? And the other part is, to say, so one of the mandates of Cita is supposed to be to provide an advisory role across government and to set standards in this ICT space, or to verify and, to ratify standards that come in the ICT space. And I think as a government, I think we've kind of forgotten about that role and have been so focused on the procurement and purchasing part that we've now left that. And so now, are we not having a situation where we're now trying to build parallel structures because there's one structure that's not working properly, and we need to augment the strength around that for us to be able to move forward. So, for example, centralizing or creating framework agreements around procurement, especially for big ticket items. Some of the things that, as Hermie mentioned in the Cita study, Microsoft licensing, for example, the government is spending over 2 billion, I think, across the country in Microsoft licensing, and everyone's buying their little piece, and somehow finding a way to centralize that, and then negotiating better rates might be something useful, and how that can be achieved would be something that we would want to definitely have conversations with the OCPO to see some of the good work and carrying through these recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, to be fair to Veli, Maybe really you can answer these, and then we'll get to Cita and James, if that's okay.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you so much, colleagues, for those comments and questions. I think the big question or elephant in the room is really about discussions that are happening about repurposing Cita. And to be fair to the Cita colleagues, they were really participating in our sessions. In fact, when we started the study, we invited them because the JCPS departments are actually big client departments for Cita. So they really were coming forth to the party. What I think is important is to try to see how that discussion of repurposing Cita is going, because they indicated that there are processes in place to even amend the Cita legislation to try to repurpose and to look at what is going to be the specific role that Cita does. From a security cluster perspective, the heavy dependency that we criticize is actually also understandable because there are security problems, and these systems that Cita actually manages for departments like police, they're the ones who actually have been working for so many years, and therefore even how you migrate to a different arrangement needs to be managed very carefully because there are security risks, there are data breaches that could actually happen, etc., etc. So we have to then check how is Cita going to be repurposed and by when is that going to happen? Because as it is, departments, some of them were telling us that, you know, we only go to Cita for serious things. I remember, I think it was one of the departments in the sample, they say we really go to Cita for those things that we can't find, but others we find it ourselves. So there's an uneven way of even doing procurement. They look at what the Cita Amendment Act says, and they also look at what the regulation says. And then for mainframe and compulsory services, they pay Cita. But for them to procure stuff on their own, then they go about that. So that strategic framework or that procurement policy, I think is going to be very important. And my recommendation would be to engage with Cita because they also have got their own transversal contracts. The other issue that I also want to flag is that there are capacity problems even with Cita itself. You know, they do not have enough staff that they're able to find. They can't even appoint service providers sometimes on time. And we saw this in the case of the police. They got a rollover in the previous financial year and they couldn't spend some of the funds, and now they've applied for another or a second rollover. And the reasons are quite similar, that, you know, the tender processes that have to go through Cita, they take much longer. So that repurposing discussion, in my view, will become much better because certain services departments will procure themselves, and then maybe Cita will have a different role that it therefore performs. The other limitation that relates to also procurement and even planning in departments is that the SLA meetings that are supposed to happen between Cita and departments are not happening on time, and this even affects the submission of government orders. So, for example, the procurement framework should be quite clear and say by when should all departments submit their government orders, because also Cita does not receive that information from departments on time, and departments are also to blame for that. So if they do not submit or get the information on time, then they can't procure on time, and then it also affects the the spending patterns as well. And then to be more also specific now to try to talk about some of the issues that have been raised. I think to Michael's point about modernization, you know, ICT is quite a very problematic area in government, and I think the pace of transformation is really not so good, especially in the government context. If you look at what has happened in technology outside, you look at the fact that a few years ago, we never had an Uber, we never had a Bolt, but today we have got those applications. But you look at the resources we spend in government to modernize. We say we are modernizing, but it's taking forever and ever. So it's very difficult to manage that process. I think departments must be better capacitated, especially small ones. You made reference to the small ones. They can appoint their own network programmers. They can have few software programmers and pay them at competitive rates. The rates that STATS pays, for example, is even compatible with the banks, because we also looked at some of the studies that banks did and see on average how much do you pay an IT technician at entry level. You know, it's plus minus 700,000 per annum. That's a DD in government, and STATS has those people as well. So it then helps the department to streamline its own processes and also have people who know these case management systems, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who collect the information and they're the ones who do that. And that will also help us to reduce this heavy dependency on Cita, because Cita comes when departments call. If departments don't review their budget, if then they don't do a prioritization exercise that says, actually from the basket of services that we are being given by Cita, this one we can do it on our own and we can save on cost. Those are sort of hard conversations that I think should happen in that respect. And the other issue that also Hemi mentioned was around systems. In the first round of 2020, Hemi, we actually even ranked the system that the SAPS has, because there are so many, even the crime-related ones, even the detective-related ones, they are actually quite a lot. But the main issue there is the manner in which those systems are integrated, whether they can effectively demonstrate that the criminal record systems that we have and even security clearance systems that we have are integrated, right? Justice can have access to the data and even Home Affairs. But the performance part, I think, in our reviews is a problem. You know, you can't really effectively demonstrate that the data that comes from this systems and even the value add of the integration, it's not so clear. And it's been happening for so many years. We've been talking about modernizing and integrating the systems for so many years, but we still have performance gaps, we still have poor spending, and we also still have these internal inefficiencies within these departments. And then there was the issue that was also raised. I'm happy, Pale, to share our report and our presentation, and I think your unit and division actually was quite useful during the review, because some of the data that we got was actually from lodges, and we've been working together with some of the colleagues from the OCPO, so we'll be happy to share the report and also have engagements with you. And that discussion of strategic procurement, I think, is very, very important, because telecoms, software, and all these big ticket items are very important, and there's a need to have a good strategy of how they are being managed and even procured across government. I hope I have responded to all the questions that have been asked. If not, I'll then just ask the colleagues maybe to come back.
Thanks, Billy. No, I think many of what was said was covered, and you know, it was more comments that were made. Okay, so next on the floor is Sitabiso. And then James.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thank you so much, Veli. This was very insightful. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thanks, Chair. Just briefly for me, Chair, is you know, if you find in your study that you know there was some form of, so from what I heard in your presentation, I could get a sense that you had a feeling that there was some form of economies of scale where bigger departments tend to benefit because they are much bigger. So the cost per spending tends to be much lesser in their case. I'm just curious, I'm just taking on from Michael's question, that is that something that we can take as a general theory that maybe going forward, you know, to other departments as well, that's our position, that bigger departments tends to benefit better due to cost, you know, spending per unit. But also, I think also to replicate your study and your solutions as well, to say what then will be our solutions if that's the case. is it better to centralize contracts or is it better to capacitate? I think if you can touch on that. So first of all, did you find that there is evidence of benefiting from economies of scale? And then secondly, do you think that now, is it better, if that's the case, do we centralize? Is it better to centralize, or the issue is to capacitate smaller departments, even though the cost per unit might be higher? I think if you can answer that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sitabiso. Are you just introduce? Sorry if I don't know you. Development Treasury. So you're Treasury colleague.
Apologies, Chair. Yes, my name is Velisubuhle Buti. I'm from the Financial Sector Development Unit in National Treasury. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, James.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is James Reutenbach. I'm actually a former colleague of Sitabiso. It's good to hear your voice again, Sitabiso. I'm from the Eastern Cape Treasury. And for me, I really do support the idea about insourcing where you can and developing, you know, for SAPS and these organizations where they can, to build strong and robust internal teams. But that must also be balanced then against things like technical support. You know, LAN and desktop support is all the computer fault finding support, network support. And especially when you think about the Eastern Cape, I was chatting to some colleagues now, just trying to get my names right, but places like Sitabiso will know, like Tafelo Fefe or Madwaleni, or, you know, out in the deep rural areas of the province, where you'll have a police station without much around it, to make sure that whatever insourcing takes place, the same service levels are actually still honoured, you know, that Cita gives in terms of responding, keeping the networks up and running, making sure the computers are looked after and maintained, etc. That if that gets insourced, that internal SLA has got to be managed really well to make sure that those levels of support are there, because Cita's done a lot to work with, especially from what I understand, the Eastern Cape, to make sure that our deep rural areas are already looked after. That also talks to the actual connectivity itself. I don't know if you looked at the connectivity costs, but it is a big thing, because you know, the connectivity challenges are vast, especially in the more rural parts of our country. And SAPS is one of Cita's biggest networks with regard to actual connectivity of sites. And so that's also quite a big cost area that needs to be managed correctly to make sure that there's actual value coming out of that. And that however we go forward, I think Cita's got a key role to play in managing that network and ensuring that that network runs. And it's just a case of, like you're saying, doing proper SLA management. I liked your point about that if you sat around the table properly with Cita and manage things, you could go quite far. So thank you very much for an insightful presentation. It's been great. Thanks, colleagues. Cheers.
Okay, Veli, maybe you can respond. I see no new hands. Okay,
thank you so much, colleagues. And to your point, Star, yes, I agree with you. The example that I was showing, for example, of the Department of Justice in terms of procuring the software, the cost per user is actually quite far less, and it helps the department to save on scale. And that is actually part of the central objectives of Cita. They want to do this bulk procurement on scale so that they save money for government. But in practice, it's not happening because of the poor management of ICT contracts, of ICT management, and all of that. So I definitely support a centralized approach, because we even had conversations with colleagues who come from the private sector who actually say that the studies they conduct have shown them that IT has to be centralized. It actually helps. It makes better planning, and even control is much better. If you're going to have a contract that is going to be standardized, like an RT15 contract for mobile communication, it's much more useful to even talk to senior management and say, look, this is how much is being spent at division, at unit level, and all of that. Now have a picture of a JCPS environment whereby bulk procurement is actually being done better. It can save a lot of costs, especially for smaller departments, because then you need this bulk procurement that is even at cluster level. That's what we said to Cita, that why not even consider doing it at cluster level if there are security issues, or if there are case-specific cases that apply in JCPS but do not apply in other departments. But you could still save a lot of money. by using that centralized approach. There's also room to capacitate the smaller departments, because I think your question touched about that, because the risk we saw is that when you only have 2 IT people in a small department like civilian, you run the risk of not better managing the entire ICT budget and even a program of the department. And we actually run the risk of wasting resources, because some of the services you pay for, you could reduce them by actually capacitating yourself internally. And I agree with the points that, James, you have raised about SLA management and trying to be intentional about how you go about ICT management. It's the data that we have really shows us that departments that are intentional about managing their ICT, even their spending, it shows, even the linkage between the ICT and also some of the operations that do is quite so clear. Whereas departments that are in this blame game of Cita not doing its role effectively, also their spending is also reflecting that. And we even received data from Cita that was even showing us the spending per month, or which departments pay per month, and it was mainly within the police environment. And we saw that for many months, sometimes these departments do not pay their bills. They don't pay their bills on time. And that management it really needs to be fixed, because it then affects poor spending at the end of the financial year. So I hope I have done justice to those points, but if there's a follow-up, then I will take it. Thank you.
Thanks, Veli. Is there any follow-up? I can maybe why the people collect their thoughts, just say in the chat, you know, people appreciate your presentation. They said the presentation is very interesting and insightful. Okay, and then there's you know, just a link to the to GTACs and PEPA's knowledge hubs to point you to this webinar content and also the spending reviews. Just gratitude for the presentation. Yeah, there's lots of that. Yeah, so Kobisa said, well done, Veli, for a comprehensive study. Looking forward to seeing how departments internalize your findings and recommendations. Yeah, so people are really, and then there's a request from Caslin. Thank you for your attendance. Please take a minute to rate your experience via this link. So if the attendees, I saw at the point there were about 60 people in this meeting. Then Mandy said, thank you, Elaine and Veli. I'm Mandy Masango working with Mr. Nake. We will shout if we encounter any challenge. So I think it was very, very useful engagement. I wish to, okay, there's another, it seems to me there's another Happy Sitole. Maybe Happy, you could just introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chair, and Veli, my apology for arriving very late. So I have missed the bulk of your presentation, but indeed a very interesting topic on how we can optimize our spending. One of the things that I am not sure, maybe you already touched on it, is on the acquisition level of technology. Where people become very specific about the product, as opposed to where you define your functionality and not being specific on the product. Because those two things, we find that at that level, the market becomes very competitive when you are not very specific about the product. And I have seen a number of requests for proposals which were product specific, and in that's one of the things that cut out your competitiveness in acquisition. I just want to check if you have checked that part. And another one is whether the point of saying building capacity and have homegrown solutions is something that has been considered. I don't want to say open source, but where we can be able to customize and build own solutions, whether that could have impact on the cost of IT. Thank you, Veli.
The last one is Daniel, and with that, I think we will close after this.
Thank you. So I just wanted to speak to the last speaker just on the issue around the specificity of terms of reference and the procurement part, and you know, the value for money insourcing versus outsourcing or building our own internal systems. So theoretically, the theory goes that if government were to build or develop their own systems, in the long run, that would create more savings and would be cheaper. And also it creates an additional value point in that government has intellectual property that they can develop and customize accordingly. So when you buy systems, there's not a problem. And then when it comes to procurement or acquisition, the challenge that sits is that, again, here in the frameworks around procurement and everything, it's not a straight case to say when do you specify a product and when don't you specify a product. But this should be guided by more underlying principles in terms of the technology stack that departments and the government is using to say. So there comes a point where really, if you say that you want Office suite, you know, you're only talking about Microsoft. You know, let's call a spade a spade. In our context, yes, you could possibly use Open Office and some of the other products, but the compatibility and other issues that you then face and support then means that that is wholly excluded from your ability to purchase that. So I think you know, that acquisition point, I think, is another part maybe that the OCPO and the study that we're currently working on, Cita, we're trying to look at a bit to see how can that be done and what is the ideal way. But it is a gray area in the public sector at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Daniel. Last comments from you, Veli?
Thank you, and thanks, Daniel, for coming in on that part. And just to add, I think the issue of having people who understand what they are buying is very important, because we have had few cases where departments even buy equipment and software that is not used, and then this becomes a huge a problem of fruitless and wasteful expenditure. So again, my point about capacity, I think it's very important, because project management within departments also is quite missing. So when you have project or effective ICT project management, they're the ones who are able to show you, or they're the ones who know what system do we need, and even when we procure, which laptops perform better. I mean, there's even big problems of laptops now, even the ones that you buy, actually, although you might be paying so much more as a department, but the quality of the laptop itself is a big problem. And I think not having proper ICT project management, internal capacity is a big problem. And here we're not saying bloat IT, because there's also issues around compensation of employees, ceiling, etc. But the fact that these weaknesses of poor procurement and SCM governance even manifest themselves at the end of the financial year during audit, it shows that there's a need to capacitate internally. I think the acquisition also is also linking to Cita as well, given the fact that the procurement also is done by them, and they also struggle sometimes to find suitable service providers. So then it throws a big question on the table. Then what do we do then when we experience these delays? Should we find our own service providers, or should we procure our own equipment in that respect. So the framework should not only touch about the acquisition and the nature thereof, but it should also say what capacity should we have, you know, on a standard way in departments. Should we have ICT program managers? Should we have network programmers? And should we even have people who know IT much better, so that we don't waste money, because there's a fruitless and wasteful expenditure risk in that regard. To Happy's point about the open source, I think I had slightly touched on it, and then we're a bit careful in the review because we said this is anecdotal evidence that shows that some of the functions that departments do, they can use open source. For example, one way or the other, departments are collecting data. One way or the other, they are receiving clients. So to streamline and improve their processes, an open source platform is quite important. And we made example of the private security industry regulatory authority that has a mobile application, and this mobile application actually really has got a high number of users. It's been used now for over 3 years, and where they started utilizing the app, it was just over 200,000, and today it's almost 1 million users. So the volume is actually quite good. So the assessment should then ask the question, what services are we going to run on the open source platform? And security risk as well, because hackers also another big risk. So if we then send departments to say they must use open source and their security breaches and risks, it might actually undo the very recommendations that we are putting on the table. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Veli. This was, thank you for the energy you brought to the presentation and to the effort you put into the slides. It was just example of a good presentation, taking the gist out of everything and focusing on this discussion, which it seems is very far from exhausted. So I invite everybody to engage offline as well. And if you happen to miss something, there's GTAC has a YouTube channel where this content is also available for view. So I hope that Veli will get like a million hits here on this one. Okay, and with that, I wish to thank our staff who organized the session, Caslin and Elaine and the team. And yeah, I want to close the session. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.